Welcome to Truth Be Found. I'm professional investigator Justin Yentis. Here we cut through the noise, dig deep, and uncover what others overlook. If you're ready to roll up your sleeves and get to the bottom of the story, you've come to the right place. Let's get to work. Hey folks, I want to welcome everyone back to our new studio here at Truth Be Found. Today's episode isn't just about analyzing the use of force, it's about being inside the moment when someone pulls the trigger. What does it actually feel like to take life in self-defense? What's running through a person's mind in that split second? And how do you explain that to a jury who has never been there? Dennis Root is back with us again this week, and Dennis wasn't just an expert witness in the Zimmerman trial. He was responsible for taking the jury inside that moment, and today he's going to take us there too. So Dennis, I want to welcome you back to the show.
I appreciate you having me back.
Dennis, most people think that they understand self-defense. They've seen headlines, they've debated it, but they've never been there. So what does it feel like to stand in the moment where you believe that you have no other choice but to shoot, but to stop a threat? Could you explain to our listeners what it does to your mind and your body in that moment?
Oh, wow. That would be we could spend an entire day on just that.
You totally could.
Alone. But to try to bring it in, the fact that it's different for every single individual can't be understated.
Mm-hmm.
That when you look at an event, and I like to refer to it as a life-changing event, because that's truly what it is. It's an event that even if you try to prepare for it, if you've never been through it, you don't know what to expect. Because during that moment, when an individual actually feels the gravity of somebody else trying to seriously hurt or kill them, if they're not prepared, their body, everything starts just basically closing down, because every human being has one hardwired element for survival, without question. So the brain, once you perceive that there's a deadly force threat presented to you, that somebody wants to take your life, everything else that's not important to the brain starts getting kicked off. Your hearing can be shut down. Your vision can be narrowed dramatically. They call it tunnel vision. It can definitely be brought in. Your heart rate, respirations go up. I mean, everything about your physical being gets dedicated to one thing and one thing only, and that's survival.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are even cases, and they don't like to talk about this element, but they have people that after these events have soiled themselves, and they're like, oh, they're embarrassed by it, but they don't understand. You could be the greatest warrior in the world and be stuck in a war zone somewhere, and that's still going to happen to you because that's a physiological response.
Right.
Your body is saying, I don't need that, get rid of it. And that's the same thing with how they perceive the environment around them. They stop seeing things because the brain is saying, that's all that's important right now, this person that wants to kill me.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think I've heard that before. It was in a book, I believe it was called On Killing, which I'm...
On Combat and On Killing. Those are both written by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman.
That's right. Yeah, we had another case where that same situation came up, and it was very difficult to explain to the jury that, these type of reactions are very normal and expected in a fight or flight situation. Now, I bet that there was a time when you were taking on the Zimmerman case, for example, when you realized that this case wasn't going to be just another trial, but something that could kind of follow you forever. Is that accurate? Could you tell us when you realized the gravity of the case that you were involved in?
When I pursued that case initially, it was because of what I saw in the media.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a controversial case that was coming up, but I noticed one element that really drew my attention to it was how quotes that were attributed to Mr. Zimmerman on the media screen had dots in the middle. It had a sentence and 3 dots, and anybody that follows us for any period of time knows
Right.
that means something was there that was taken out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what piqued my interest. I never truly imagined how gigantic the impact would be as far as like nationwide impact of this, because instead of it being, and a lot of people always say, well, that was a stand your ground case. And the reality was it wasn't. It was a self-defense case. They didn't file a stand your ground claim in that. And but most people don't understand stand your ground as a concept. But the fact that that self-defense case became more focused on misinformation and direct lies about not only the decedent, Mr. Martin, but also about the interactions involving George Zimmerman, both prior to and during that event. It really turned into something that, let's put it this way, when I actually went to court, the sheriff's office actually had teams assigned for security to ensure nothing happened to me while I was actually in court. So
Well,
it really and I mean, I have a law enforcement career of almost 3 decades, and that was the first time where I went to court with the feeling like, wow, eyes are on me, and these people are so driven by their emotion that who knows what could happen. It was like an explosive waiting to detonate.
mhm. Boy, that, people love to debate whether or not someone should or shouldn't have fired. And I remember when this case was in the media, there was a lot of that same argument going on online and on the news stations, where folks would take snippets of the truth and partial facts, and then debate those that they chose to include in their discussion. Did you find, or what was your experience about, as you went through this case, trying to explain the full complex truth of what happened that night to the jury and to the decision makers in that courtroom?
Well, when it came to the actual facts of the case, most people outside of the courtroom were making, or they were forming opinions on either only partial information or no real information at all. And it's very, every use of force, you have the objective element to it, but you have this subjective element to it, which is you and I are very different. Every person is so different that what scares me may not scare you, and vice versa.
Well, and what is the difference between those two, just before we move forward, between the objective and the subjective issues?
Objective, consider it this way, objective elements are things that can be applied and considered as a norm across the board. For example, a use of force, the person who uses it has to be assessed or evaluated based on how would somebody of a similar background, training, and experience respond in a similar situation. So it's very broad sweeping.
Mm-hmm.
But what most people don't pay attention to that they really need to is the subjective elements, which is, if you say, how would an average person respond? Would it be objectively reasonable for a person to do X? Well, what are the elements of that person? A 6'2", 200-pound muscle bound male is going to have a very different expectation than a 120-pound slender build female,
Mm-hmm.
because there's just physical dynamics that are greatly different between the two people. And whether it's man or woman or man and man, the subjective elements are looking at what characteristics, what background, what training does that person have that formed the decision to use whatever force they did. And in the Zimmerman case, it was the ultimate shooting of another human being, and most of the people that were having the argument, oh, he shouldn't have done this, or he shouldn't have done that, or this is the way it should have gone. A real easy one for you, the person that says, well, if he hadn't gotten out of the truck, this wouldn't have happened. That's true. I never argued that at all. But the reality was, getting out of the truck wasn't wrong and wasn't illegal.
Right.
And he wasn't, despite what the media said, he was never told not to get out of the truck. So,
Mm-hmm.
but the average person hears information. They presume, since it's the first information they heard, that it's the accurate information. And when they hear the truth, they personally want to fight it because it's not what they knew, because we're changing their reality. We're changing their understanding.
Okay.
And that's really what the expert needs to do with a jury, is try to get them to understand these are what we need to look at, not what you've heard here.
So there's got to be a shift at some point in someone that's in a self-defense scenario, where it goes from fear to action in some in some way. Is that correct? Could you walk us through kind of what goes through the shooter's mind when they make that decision, or if they even have the time to make that decision at all?
Every person, for me, when I do the training and I try to break these down into their critical elements, the vital elements that need to be considered, what's going through somebody's mind, if whatever the event is, whatever the weapon is being presented, if any, the threat is, I'm going to take your life.
Mm-hmm.
Every human being, when they reach that point, they're going to experience just like the standard elements of fight or flight. You have fight, flight, or freeze. Those are pretty much the three outcomes of high degrees of stress. When somebody, even those that may think they have prepared for it, but haven't, they may have physically prepared for it, but they didn't mentally prepare for it. So really, when you look at the average person who finds themselves in this situation, the moment, and I try to get this across to people, the moment that your brain tells you, oh my God, he's trying to kill me or she's trying to kill me, when that thought enters your head, there is a value to that. And people say, well, based on what? How many times a day do you walk around and feel like somebody's trying to kill you? Unless you have a
Very
mental
rarely.
health issue. Usually we don't have that thought entering into our minds very often.
Right.
So that element, when you couple it with actions of other people, that is a devastating perception. And for an individual that is faced with a choice, I can die or I can stop them. That's the choice. Sadly, if you use weapons like firearms, things like that, stopping them can result in their death.
Mm-hmm.
But again, am I going to die? I have a family I want to go home to every day. I'm going to stop you. I didn't ask for this. You did this to me, so I need to do whatever I need to do. And that's the part that really trips up a lot of people, especially if they're just looking at the force event from the outside.
And I would imagine that you've spent a lot of time with people that have had to use deadly force in a self-defense situation. Could you tell me what they've conveyed to you, or what you've learned from these folks that have shared their experiences of that process? How did the experience differ from what they expected?
I've had the opportunity to interview individuals that have no training at all the way up through law enforcement professionals that have had themselves placed in a situation where they have to shoot someone.
Mm-hmm.
And one very interesting common element that I found, a characteristic, was how a majority of them were like, I can't believe they did this. Meaning, I can't believe this person tried to kill me. What I have found is they try to take their morals and their values and place it onto another person.
Mm-hmm.
And try to say, well, why would he do this? I mean, they're just completely dumbfounded why somebody would want to do that to them, because they're applying probably values or mores that don't enter into the other person's mind, And when I isolate it to just citizens, individuals that don't have the same training opportunities that law enforcement does, I find a lot of they're very glad that they survived, but there's a lot of regret for what happened. They didn't get up that day wanting to do this to someone.
Right.
And it's traumatizing.
That's, I've only worked with a couple who have been in these self-defense, life or death situations. But I think that some of the folks that opine on these scenarios, they feel that the person that has used a deadly weapon in self-defense somehow feels good about it or proud about what had happened, or they had shown their power by shooting an aggressor. Is that your experience, or is it the opposite?
Now, my experience, the majority, if I had to put a number on it, 97% of the people that I have dealt with, from the citizen to the law enforcement professional to military personnel, that when they're forced to make this decision, they don't wear it like a badge of honor.
Mm-hmm.
They they start second, what else could I have done? Well, maybe what if? And the problem is they lose sight of the fact that you didn't initiate this. You didn't bring this. You didn't get up that day and go to work or go to school or whatever the case might be seeking this. This was a traumatic event that was forced on you. And then they go through these things. And if it's something like the Michael Masters case or the George Zimmerman's case, where it's nationally, you're starting to get all this press on it, then they really start feeling bad because they're seeing all these horrendous things being said about them
Hmm.
based on nothing that's accurate.
Right.
They're only getting a little piece of truth, if any, and then people are blowing it up in a direction that serves their purposes.
Yeah, that's got to be very traumatizing to someone that's already been through a horribly traumatic experience when they've been faced with a life or death situation like that.
It's one of those things, one of the statistics, especially when I'm teaching law enforcement, is people physically prepare for a use of force. They'll go to the range, they'll enhance their shooting skills, or maybe they'll enhance their physical capabilities through martial arts or something like that. But they don't invest a lot of time in the mental preparation it takes for the event.
Hmm.
They might mentally prepare for getting through it, but they don't mentally prepare for what the outcome will be. And one of the things that I always try to tell people in all of, especially if it's a deadly force related training, I try to impress upon people that you have to be mentally prepared for the outcome of whatever you're doing. If you're going to strike somebody with an object, if you're going to pull a knife, if you're going to pull a gun, whatever the defensive measure is, it's one thing to physically do it, but it's another to mentally accept the outcome of whatever it is you are doing. It could seriously hurt or kill another person. And there are tremendous numbers of law enforcement professionals who have been through all the training and done all these things, yet after a shooting, they stopped being cops.
Hmm.
They weren't mentally prepared. And people say, oh, they're the tough guy. It's got nothing to do with toughness. It's about mental impacts of such a traumatic event.
Wow. Wow. So the mental anguish that someone must go through really has to be intense coming out of a self-defense action like that. Can you break down in a step-by-step a real life self-defense shooting situation? And we can change the names if we need to. But I'd like to go through what the different steps are that people experience when they get into that situation, and whether this be Zimmerman or some other individual that you worked with. Can you walk us through? I mean, let's kind of take it step by step, because we want to paint a picture for the jury or for their listeners. So there's got to be a lead up, right? And that we can use an example of the Zimmerman case. He's in a pickup and he's in this townhouse community. Can you walk us through kind of what George or if you want to use someone else, what they saw, what they heard, what they felt in that moment before the actual threat appeared?
It's, if you look, and let's just look at the George Zimmerman case, because there's an element in that case that I thought was very telling when I was listening to the audio recordings over the 911 calls, and the non-emergency call that Mr. Zimmerman made in this case. He's answering every question. You have people that they're in a mindset that they think they're doing the right thing at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And even Mr. Zimmerman, when he was answering the calls, he had stopped his vehicle in the area of the clubhouse pool area. I think it was like the clubhouse at the community. As he was talking, you could hear his voice. He's answering questions. It's very calm and steady. And then at that same time, Mr. Martin turns around and starts heading back toward him in his vehicle. And you can hear the anxiety shoot up in the recording.
Mm-hmm.
Because he went from talking about a guy that was walking away from him and not posing any concern for his immediate safety to a guy who's coming back. And now he's directly approaching him. And when you hear that change in audio, a listener who's actually knows what to look for and to listen for, you hear the anxiety and fear start to bubble.
In that case, did you actually have someone come in and analyze his voice inflection and whatnot in the recording?
They didn't have to go that far with it
Oh,
because of the
was
fact
that
because
apparent?
I picked this up when I was listening to it, because as I was listening to it, with my background and experience and working with a lot of people, and my job at the sheriff's office at the time is we would do scenario-based training, and I would create environments designed to be highly stressful for the law enforcement professional. And you would hear a full-grown man, 200-pound man, sound like a 13-year-old girl over a radio because of the stress that goes up.
Mm-hmm.
So you start to key in on these audible type changes, especially as men become more stressed. You'll hear the octave of their voice going up.
Okay.
And you can go on YouTube probably and find a bunch of videos of cops that are in the middle of the event while they're screaming for help. They're not screaming with the bass level that they normally speak with. It's much, much higher pitch.
Mm-hmm. And so that's
And
what you picked up on in that 911 recording?
I did, and his pace changed. It picked up pace. And the one thing about stress is it starts pushing you faster.
Mm-hmm.
The more stress you don't get more relaxed, you get anxious. You start trying to do things quicker because concept of time goes right out the window.
Mm-hmm.
And in this particular matter, leading up to the actual encounter, he was trying to accommodate and provide information being asked for by the 911 operator. And a lot of people think he got out just chasing them, and that's not true. There was only one time where he saw Mr. Martin take off running, and he was between buildings, down a sidewalk between the buildings, and it was like a T intersection. So he got out of his truck and he was hustling over there to get to where he last saw him so he could report on it. And that's when dispatch, already out of the vehicle, halfway across the property, that's when he said, are you following him? And Mr. Zimmerman said, well, yeah. He goes, we don't need to do that. And he's like, okay. And he got them the information on the address, turned around and was heading back to his truck, just hung up with 911 when the attack happened.
Okay.
Because he got back to a location that Mr. Martin was laying in wait.
Okay. So can you walk us through what the decision-making process was like for George in that moment when he had to make the decision whether or not to shoot?
In this particular matter, and the common denominator in all of the use of force cases where somebody has to use deadly force to protect themselves, the attack takes place, and at first it's resistance. And when I say resistance, it's the individual protecting themselves in the best way that they know how, until they begin to believe that this person doesn't want to hurt me. This person wants to kill me. At that moment, their stress levels, everything just shoots straight through the roof, and their physical skills diminish. But one thing that I've noticed, whether it's the Zimmerman case or others, when they have a weapon that equalizes the event, they struggle to get to it. But once it's out and presented, a good majority of them use it.
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody that carries a firearm that brings it out to use it does so because they weren't prepared to use it. They just think carrying a gun is going to save their life. So when the bad thing happens to them, having a gun just gives something to the bad guy to use against you.
Mm-hmm.
And that has happened. But those that actually carry it with the intent that if I need to, I will, at that moment, they're not thinking about anything other than themselves. People want to say, well, they did this on purpose. If you want to say somebody hunted somebody down to kill them, there's going to be a lot of information that you're going to be able to acquire to show this was an intentional act based solely on what this person wanted.
Right.
When it's a moment of fear-induced response, the evidence of hunting, as they like to call it, isn't there. All you have is, and especially when you have independent witnesses saying, hey, this guy was on top and all I saw was a ground and pound. Mr. Zimmerman, in this matter, he actually was in a position of complete disadvantage, and the only thing that saved him that night was pulling a firearm out and discharging it.
You mentioned that the witnesses described what you called a ground and pound. Why don't you explain what that means and what the witnesses actually saw?
One of the advantages we had that night is because of the weather, the Mr. Zimmerman and Mr. Martin were wearing attire that made it very clear that they the attire they were wearing clearly differentiated them from one another.
Hmm.
So when the call comes in, the independent witness could identify the person on top by their clothing. And Mr. Zimmerman was not the clothing that they described was that of Mr. Martin, not Mr. Zimmerman, which some people wanted to say he was on top, but that proved to be completely untrue.
Hmm.
Physical evidence, not just statements, but physical evidence verified that to be not true. But the witness saw the person on top, which was Mr. Martin. He described him, and he used the example of what he had seen in MMA fighting and things like that, where you have somebody that gets on top of somebody in a ring and is just raining blows down unanswered onto the party who's laying on their back.
Hmm.
That's what they meant by a ground and pound. The person that was in the position of advantage was just raining punches down onto Mr. Zimmerman, punching him repeatedly.
Oh, that definitely didn't come out in the media. I mean, until the very end, and through not all of the actual mainstream media sources reported it that way, unfortunately.
That's 100% correct. It's just like most people don't know that that case, the Zimmerman case, had been presented to the state attorney's office more than once for criminal consideration. And more than once, they determined it was a self-defense case. It wasn't until they appointed a special prosecutor,
Mm.
and before even a grand jury was convened and held to present the evidence to, they initiated or they got the warrant for Mr. Zimmerman's arrest. So
Did
there
the,
was a lot of information that was available that nobody was being given because, my perspective on it now, looking back on it, especially this many years later, they didn't want to give it because it didn't fit the narrative that was being formed about the event.
Mhm. Did the defense have an opportunity to go and challenge the grand jury proceedings or bring up the prior grand jury testimony to show that it had failed multiple times?
Well, there was never a grand jury. It's my understanding that the day that the warrant was issued, was like a day or two before the grand jury was supposed to meet to consider the information to find out whether or not they were going to indict or have a no true bill.
Okay.
So the evidence never even got to a jury of his peers, into a grand jury to be able to be reviewed before criminal prosecution. And the information that was provided in the affidavit, I read the affidavit that was submitted for the warrant and for his arrest, and it was missing so much information. It is true that when you go to a grand jury, the state has all the cards because there's
Oh, yeah.
nobody arguing
No,
back.
there's no one else.
Because and that's why they say you can indict a ham sandwich.
Right.
Well, if the evidence was so strong in this case, you shouldn't have had any issue with a grand jury, and that would have really bolstered your position. But I believe, it is my personal opinion, that they didn't present it to a grand jury because they knew if all of this information was actually provided, there's no way anybody would have looked at them and said, "Oh yeah, that's clearly not self-defense. This is murder."
Mhm.
You couldn't arrive at that when you looked at all of the information.
Okay. Wow, that just sounds like a disaster on so many levels. And, as you got into trial, I'm sure you were tasked with the task of explaining to a jury, many of which have never held a gun, never have, very few people have been in a life or death situation like that. How is it that you were able to convey to the jury what Zimmerman was experiencing in that moment?
I think what it came down to, because obviously they found him not guilty. And I truly believe that what it came down to was somebody being there that could answer the accusations made by the state. For example, when the state wanted to use the fact that the sweatshirt was away from the body, and they tried to say, well, isn't it true that if he wasn't in this position, if he was like this, then that bullet's trajectory and how it impacted him would have been different. My background and experience, I was able to take what they were asking and tell a jury, in order for that to happen. And again, I'm a firm believer, you have to put yourself in the shoes of both people,
Right.
the person who's been killed and the person who did the killing. That's you. If you don't, you're doing yourself a disservice. But when I put myself in that position and I tried to go down the path that the state, for example, was leading, you would have to hold the gun in this crazy position to make it work out.
Mhm.
So if I take the evidence or the information you want to project as being telltale, you have to consider how would the other person's actions interact with that. And I think that when you don't have an expert or an investigator that can really explain those dynamics, the information can get lost in translation and you have a jury that can't understand it. And I thank God that I have the opportunity to explain my life's work and understanding for open hand control tactics, firearms, the whole 9 yards, to a group of people so that they can make an informed decision about the information being presented to them.
Mhm.
And that's, to me, in that whole event, in every case that I've been involved in, that's the most important element of that testimony, is making sure they hear the evidence in the real light, not just tainted by one person's perspective or another.
And that's something that you and I have talked about in, well, pretty much every case that I've brought to you, is taking someone back to the actual scene in that moment and reliving it under the circumstances by which the actual defendant experienced this event. How is it that you, as an expert, can go back into the mind of your defendant at that time and accurately convey what they felt or what they should have felt, and make a determination as to the justification for their actions?
I think that the most important thing that anyone can do is actually go back to the location at the scene, go to the scene of the
Mhm.
actual event, and try to go there at a time where the lighting and the environment is as close to the night as the event as possible. Because all too often, investigators, for example, they're called out to a scene at 1 o'clock in the morning, and the detectives get there at 4 o'clock in the morning. And then the next thing you know, it's 6 o'clock and the lighting is changing. The entire
Mhm.
environment is changing, and you're going to see things that weren't visible to the individuals involved. And you won't get a true feeling for darkness can create fear in just about anybody.
Mhm.
Because the reality is, from the time we're little and as we grow up, if you want somebody to feel comfortable, if you put anybody in a house and like a spook house, how many spook houses has anybody ever been to that's well lit,
Very few.
right?
Right.
It's not much fun to go in there because they can't scare you,
Mhm.
because you don't know what's hiding around the corner. But you get this feeling inside, this apprehension that can only be induced by the environment. And then you add the element of what the other person is doing. For me, when I get involved in these matters, I try to put myself in their shoes. How did this lighting impact me? If I didn't know these things, if I don't know how to fight on the ground, on my back, if I'm not aware of any of this, how would I perceive the attack that's coming at me?
Mhm.
You know, those are all elements and conditions that you have to be able to explain to a group of people, but you have to do it in a way like I did just right there. What's a connection point? A spook house, going to a haunted house. Well, now most people have been in a haunted house.
Right.
So they know how darkness actually impacts you. Let's take vision. A great example is vision. People think that what you look at, you see. When I'm trying to explain it doesn't work that way, have you ever watched a TV show and had to rewind it because you missed something? Well, wait a minute. Your eyes are looking at a box that's this size. How did you not see everything on the screen? And that helps drive home the point that your vision's 1 to 3 degrees of your actual visual spectrum or what you're focusing on. Or the old adage of, where's my keys? They're right on the desk in front of you. Why didn't you see them? Because they weren't within that small area of vision that you were focused on. So being able to go to them and help them not only feel what it's like to be in that dark environment or to feel these critical elements, but also to point out to them everyday experiences that they have that show that when somebody says, oh, it's not true, he should have seen that. It's in the, another great one. The camera saw it. Why didn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the camera's not focused in on any one thing. The camera's capturing whatever's within the view of the camera.
Right.
The camera could be facing here straight ahead, and I could be looking off to the left. I don't get to see what's straight ahead of me because I'm looking over here. So being able to go to these people and say, think about your own personal experience and put it on a level that connects to them, I think that's what helps them understand the evidence in every case when it comes to the use of force. And these people that want to say, well, we don't need an expert because we have the video. Okay, but now you're going to tell them that everything the video sees, the poor person saw?
Mm-hmm.
And if it's a security camera, it's looking at the event from a completely different perspective than what you and I would be looking at it from.
Right. It's not a body cam.
Exactly. And people understand fear because everybody's experienced fear at some point in their life. The truth comes, or the real issue is getting the truth to the person to show them how that fear that they've experienced on a minor scale impacted this person when they thought they were going to die.
Mm-hmm. As I look at this case, the Zimmerman case, when you strip away the media and politics and the debates and all of the drama that surrounded this media circus, the actual case was about a moment of fear and a decision to act. And could you kind of walk us through what you took away from this case, what you learned about yourself and the use of force issue and how it's conveyed to the public? What was it that you walked away from, or walked away with, I should say?
One of the major things that I took away from this case, the George Zimmerman case, was, and I learned it also following it because the media would contact me on a regular. I would go on to media shows to help. They had me not only on the Zimmerman case, but many other cases coming in as an expert to explain things.
Mm-hmm.
But I learned very quickly that they weren't looking for somebody to explain from a neutral perspective. They were looking for somebody that was going to further a narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're dealing with somebody experiencing a life-changing event that forces them to take the life of another person, politics, agendas, all that business, that has no business in the courtroom.
Mm-hmm.
None. And I'm thankful that in this particular matter and in many of the matters, the court has sadly put a lot of limitations on what the experts can talk about, but it helps negate the political elements or the agenda-driven elements if you have somebody that understands how to break it down. And in this case, I learned a lot about myself as far as how easy it could be to allow a personal or political agenda to take you down a path that has nothing to do. If you really stop and think about what you're saying, is it based on the facts or is it based on your personal opinion because you don't like something?
Mm-hmm. And I've noticed that in many of the consults that I've done with, be it attorneys or private citizens that come into our office, often they are looking for information to push a narrative or push an argument, or they've got an end result in mind. And often my response is, well, I can't necessarily tell you what the outcome is. I can only provide all of the facts, and then it will be up to a judge or a jury or an arbiter to make a determination on how those facts land in your specific case. But as investigators and, in your case, an expert witness, I think it's very important to maintain your integrity and always present the facts as the facts, and not try and manipulate those to any end goal on your end or my end. That's for other people to do.
Absolutely.
It's our jobs as investigators and experts to present the unbiased truth. And I'm glad that there are those out there, like you and others that are willing to do that. This had to be a very traumatic experience for you to go through. I've had some cases that have been, blown up in the national media. This one was a different animal. We had our then president at the time making comments about it that really incited a lot of anger at likely you and the defense team and Mr. Zimmerman, and it was a horrible situation that happened that night. I don't think anyone would say otherwise. But even in that horrible situation, we have to parse out what is true and what is an agendized argument.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head with, we have an obligation, and I think society has an obligation, but especially the investigators and the people involved in the judicial process, you have an obligation to remain neutral and allow the facts to speak for themselves. In that particular case, in many of the cases, when I testify, I tell them, look, I'm just telling you what the facts tell me. I've been attacked on the stand and they'll say things and I'm like, I'm not saying that. The facts are saying that. Well, you're not, and I'm like, I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm just relating what the facts say. Oh,
Right.
aren't you getting paid to be here? And they want it to be about how much money I make because of my background, training, and experience. And they want to forget about what the facts are.
Right.
And the people involved in these processes, if they just let the facts speak for themselves and lead them in whatever
And
direction the facts are going to
and
take
don't
you,
hide from them.
you can't change the facts.
Right.
They are what they are. Now, are some facts open to interpretation? Well, pointing a gun is a fact. Whether or not I was threatening your life or defending mine, well, now we need more information to determine what pointing that gun meant. But if we had more people dedicated to just allowing the facts of a case to lead them, instead of them thinking they already know. Maybe they know a little bit about the person. Maybe they don't like the person. Maybe whatever the case, maybe they don't like guns. I don't know. But if they have already a preconceived position, then they look for the facts that support that. And that's a bias that needs to be rooted out of our judicial system. It's not possible because people are human beings,
Right.
and they'll be guided by their personal perception. It's very difficult not to get tied up in your opinions and just allow the facts to speak.
Well, I'll tell you, controversy sells. I had
That's a fact.
an interview with a prosecutor. I think it was a year or two ago, and we had some time in between our interviews. We were preparing for trial, and this prosecutor brought up to me this issue in Arizona state law, and she said, we've got an issue here where someone can use deadly force in self-defense as long as there's a residence on their property. And they had made an argument that a tent could be a residence, but that if that temporary residence was not present, then your use of force to protect yourself and your property was unjustified. So they wanted a minor change in the law to change, I think it was from an and to an or, to make it so that if you're a rancher out on a piece of property and you get attacked, that you have the same right, whether or not you have a tent on that property, to defend your property. or whether or not
Right.
it is your home to defend your home. And so I made a couple of changes to the law, send it off to a lawmaker, asked if they liked it, and if they did, they could pass it on to the legislature. And that one minor modification turned into an argument of whether or not this bill was a hidden agenda to hunt undocumented immigrants. And it made it onto the news, and it all kind of blew up over someone that wanted to take true facts and apply an agenda to them. And it completely distorted everything that was trying to be argued. And I see that in courtrooms today. I mean, from the prosecution side, the defense side, everyone has an agenda to convey. And granted, we're in an oppositional system, an adversarial system with our judicial system. And so that's how the process is set up. But allowing all of the facts to come in, I think, is going to be key as we continue as a nation. Preventing people from knowing all of the information that goes into a trial, or all of the information that leads the person to make a choice that they made, in my opinion, is a great miscarriage of justice. If we're not transparent, and if we're not transparent with our juries and allowing them to have the full scope of the case before they have to determine guilt or innocence, I don't understand how folks can feel that they can make an accurate decision.
Well, I don't think that the truth be told, I don't believe it can.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, at the end of the day, we all make our decisions based on the information we have available to us at the time that we make the decision.
Mm-hmm.
And if we learn something later, it could change. Wow, I wouldn't have done that if I knew this.
Right.
Okay. When it comes to our judicial system, there are things that I understand that, could be prejudicial. So they look at something and say, well, no, we don't want that in because that doesn't have anything to do with this.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm that's 100% accurate. But when you look at a self-defense case, for example, and you're trying to say, well, that in the George Zimmerman case, Trayvon Martin had texted with a cousin saying that the first thing you do when you're going to fight is punch them in the nose, get their nose bleeding, their eyes watering kind of thing. Well, that's exactly the attack that took place on George Zimmerman.
Mm-hmm.
The description of how he was trying to coach another person on how to start the fight is exactly how that fight, but that was prejudicial, so it couldn't come in.
They didn't find that probative to the issue at hand.
So, I mean, but there were so many examples of things
Right.
like that didn't get into, and that's okay. I mean, the judge is the gatekeeper, and the judge is supposed to be a neutral party that says, I'm just going to make sure the jury gets what they need to know and not something that could taint it
Right.
in one direction or another. And I'm good with that, but I really question sometimes the efficacy of how are you serving that person if we can't let the jury of their peers know as much as we can about that particular thing.
Right. Well, and especially in a case like Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman, because you are specifically going into their mindset in that moment. Now, I suppose arguably you could say that Zimmerman didn't know what Martin had texted previously, and so that wouldn't have gone into his decision-making process. And I'm sure that was somewhere along the lines of the argument that was made by the prosecution. But the fact that someone had made comments or had trained someone else in how to conduct an attack like that, in my opinion, or my limited view right now, seems like that would be an important fact for the jury to know.
I agree also. And that's one of the things, when people ask, well, how could you do this or that? Look, you don't know everything that I've seen. You don't
Right.
know all the information because you're only getting what you're seeing on the 6 o'clock news from this particular news channel. That's
Right.
not all the information available in a case. And the jury should get all the information that's available in the case, but they don't because they determine whether or not something is prejudicial, whether it's, it doesn't, like you mentioned, well, that doesn't mean that that's what he did here. Okay.
Hmm.
I'm okay with that. If that's the reason you're doing it, but
Right.
I know that that's a good piece of information that would definitely have sway.
Right.
It doesn't, but leaving that out, and this is the one thing about self-defense, use of force, and facts. Leaving that one piece out didn't change the facts of the event.
Hmm.
That's why a jury found him not guilty, because the facts, not the emotional or political driven narratives, but the actual facts of the case showed it was self-defense.
You know how long your jury was, or do you remember how long your jury was out deliberating?
I don't remember the time. It wasn't a fast decision, but it
Mhm.
wasn't the longest one I've ever seen. That's for sure. It came back. I can't remember the exact, whether it was a day or two. That part I don't remember. It's all a whirlwind now, because during that time following it, between the media hounding me almost daily and I tried to go on the shows that I could, so that I wanted the truth to come out. I wanted people to know the facts.
Mhm.
But most of them didn't wanna ask me the questions that were relevant. They were they asked questions like, "Well, couldn't you have said this?" Well, there's a lot of things I could have said differently. That doesn't let's
Right.
talk about the case.
Well, and I think a journalist that's using their show to push a narrative. I mean, obviously that's going to be one thing you're going to want to be very leery in getting around, because you could. I mean, we could ask you questions that put you in a no-win situation. Do you think it was appropriate for George Zimmerman to hunt down Trayvon Martin while he was just coming back with a iced tea and a bag of Skittles? What are you going to say at that point? Yes, I think it was appropriate,
Yeah.
or no, my guy shouldn't have done it. I mean, this. There's ways to ask a question where you can put someone in a no-win situation. I think that's done, so it's a more interesting interview. And I've had people come on before our show and say, do you want the truth, or do you want what your listeners are going to want to hear? And I always tell them the former. We want to base everything that we put out there on objective truth and objective fact. And if that's interesting to people, great. If it's not, then they can fast forward. But I think it's very, very important to always base our opinions on as much objective truth as we can gather. So I appreciate what you are doing. Just in these past couple of weeks, you've mentioned that you've got a new website, a new podcasts that are up. Where can people find more information? And we might have covered this in our last show, but if not, where can people find more information on you and your trainings, and get up to speed on what a force investigation really looks like? Where can they find that?
The easiest way to find any of that information is, the website is called My FCTC. That's my F is in Frank, C is in Charlie, T is in Tango, C is in Charlie. myfctc.com. That MyFCTC is the new website for Force Concepts Training and
Mm-hmm.
Consulting. And on there, I've got articles, I've got podcast episodes that are being loaded. And I just finished one. We talked earlier. I just finished one on Stand Your Ground, trying to explain what it truly is beyond the myths that you hear in the media.
Right.
And there's going to be more shows. Hopefully, eventually we'll have videos, but there's also links to courses and things like that where people can get additional. And it's for investigators, but it's also I've got a children's program I'm putting out for safety. I've
That's
got
great.
crime prevention programs I'm going to be put up, and a lot of the programs are going to be free.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be not everything has to be paid for, because people say, oh, he wants to sell that. If you go on there and look, if you see something if you're an investigator looking for CEUs and things like
Right.
that, we have a course for force investigations, separating, self-defense from criminal action. And I'm actually putting together now a program on Stand Your Ground, one that specifically addresses the elements of Stand Your Ground to show in real life situations how it's applied.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. I think your info would be, it's helpful in my line of work, obviously. But even, with lawmakers or policy advisors, I think it's very important for people to be able to have access to good training and accurate information that doesn't come with an agenda. So I appreciate everything that you've put together. And Dennis, we're gonna link your information in our show notes so that if folks they want to find out more, they want to contact you, they can scroll down and find your website and find the training and the podcast that you've mentioned. And for our listeners, I want to say if this discussion made you think or question or reconsider something, please share it. You can follow us on social media, which is also linked below. And Dennis, I want to thank you again for coming on. And I want to thank you so much for everything that you've done to promote the ideas and the principles of objective truth finding. So
I thank you for having me.
Of course, it's always an honor. So we'll see everyone next time on Truth Be Found. Thank you for tuning in to Truth Be Found. The hunt for answers never stops, and neither do we. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us online to stay in the loop. Remember, truth has a way of coming to light. Until next time, keep your head up and your eyes sharp.